Over the last 2 years, the demand for mental health services has seen a dramatic increase, with support networks stretched and overwhelmed. Experts have warned of a looming cliff, and resources for vulnerable communities are in particular short supply. Dr. Tracy Westerman was well aware of that shortage even before the pandemic. Suicide rates are more than twice as high in young Indigenous Australians compared to non-Indigenous, and are the leading cause of death for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So, in 2018, Dr. Westerman set up an Indigenous scholarship to increase the number of Indigenous psychologists in Australia. The program has since continued, and this year, to help raise funds. Her institute has put together a concert supported by artists from across the country.
How's it going, everyone? John Butler here.
Ash Penfold Garlett here from Corby for Life.
Hey folks, Troy Daly here.
Kaya, my name is Gina Williams.
And my name is Guy Gauss.
And we are super excited to be playing at the Julia concert, the 2021 Julia concert for World Suicide Prevention Day.
Corroboree for Life will be supporting the Dewey Institute, Dr. Tracy Westerman and her awesome team, alongside amazing artists, to raise awareness for Indigenous mental health.
I am getting together with the Julia Institute to play a gig, and this is in all support for Indigenous child suicide prevention.
Someone much smarter than us once said that no child in a world of excess and wealth should suffer from a lack of basic needs.
I'm pleased to say that Dr. Tracy Westerman joins me now. Gee, it's good to see you. I follow you on Twitter, and I'm really pleased to actually be able to talk to you, and that everyone else can listen too is a bonus too, I guess.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for having me, and it's just wonderful to be here on the drum. Thank you.
Tracy, I'm really interested in carving out some time for you to talk about the disconnect between the lack of cultural understanding between non-Indigenous psychologists and Indigenous young people in particular, but all First Nations peoples. Talk to me about what are culture-bound disorders that might be misdiagnosed, because it's really fascinating and it really goes to the heart of your work.
Yeah, and thank you so much for starting with that. I guess what I want to start with is obviously to acknowledge that I come here tonight from Wajak country, and obviously World Suicide Prevention Day tomorrow, so I'd like to pass my respect for those who have sadly lost people through the devastation of suicide, as many of our young First Nations people have. I guess psychology, I came down to study psychology as a young kid from the Pilbara, really thinking that I was going to learn all this incredible wealth of knowledge to go back and help my communities. And back then, obviously, we already had really escalating rates of suicide. And I sat in a lecture theatre, and basically the word psychologist, Aboriginal, wasn't mentioned once in 3 years of my undergraduate psychology degree. So psychology is really built on a foundation of cultural exclusion. And so really basic things such as Aboriginal people, we make meaning of the world obvious in a very different way to how non-Indigenous people do. So the things that they actually teach you at university inadvertently actually making things worse for lots of Aboriginal people. So culture-bound syndromes that you've just talked about is a really great example of that. There are things that actually look very normal for us as Aboriginal people. They are very normal cultural expressions that are often seen from a mainstream perspective as being indicative of mental illnesses. And often people will get that wrong, not because they're intending to get things wrong, purely because they do not understand the difference between something that's culture bound and something that's not. So a great example would be, it's very common for Aboriginal people when someone's passed away to experience a spiritual visit of that loved one who's passed away. It's a very common grief reaction. And so often when you're looking at that and unpacking that story with a mainstream headspace, if you like, it's very easy to diagnose those normal cultural grief expressions as being indicative of mental illnesses. So it's very common that Aboriginal people have diagnosis of psychosis and schizophrenia. And in fact, we have diagnosis of schizophrenia and psychosis at about 17 times the rate of non-Indigenous people. And that's actually impossible to have prevalence of schizophrenia and psychosis that high. If you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong, and you make things worse. And so that's a good example of where things are going wrong.
So you've got this auditory hallucination. It looks like schizophrenia, but it's actually an entirely appropriate grief reaction for your culture to be visited by the person who has died. Another question I have that goes to the heart of that disconnect, and it's a hard one. I'm not having a go at Lifeline, but we looked at those figures. Suicide rates are more than twice as high in young Indigenous Australians compared to non-Indigenous. Hand on heart, would an Indigenous teenager who rang up Lifeline get the support they need?
Oh, look, I'm sure there are lots of counsellors in Lifeline that are doing an extraordinary job, but the training just lets them down fundamentally. So even, for example, the first step to healing is to have your reality validated by the person that you're speaking to. And as Aboriginal psychologists, I guess we've got that as a bonus, as an advantage. So it becomes really easy for us to understand the worldview, understand the story. So it becomes a lot more efficient for us to be able to get that story out. So you cannot actually prevent suicide unless you're able to get into someone's worldview and understand their reality and their story. And so often there's that real cultural disconnect without intention. It's just that the training has really let them down.